The palace of Xyrian trembled with whispers of fear as the alien princess lay pale and motionless on her crystalline bed. The corridors were filled with the soft hum of hovering servants and the low murmur of worried nobles who paced endlessly, waiting for news that never came. Outside, the sky shimmered in shades of violet and gold, casting strange patterns across the high towers that seemed to pierce the clouds like spears. The air inside the chamber was thick with the scent of alien blossoms that had been brought in at the earliest light, and they wilted slightly under the weight of the gloom. The princess herself was a fragile figure, wrapped in fabrics that glowed faintly in the dim light, her skin a delicate hue of lavender that seemed almost translucent, revealing faint patterns like the veins of leaves beneath her surface. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, and each small rise of her chest sent a ripple of light through the bed. Beneath her, the court physician hovered at the foot of the bed, his hands shaking slightly as he consulted strange devices that emitted soft beeps and whirs, and he whispered to the attending nurses, their faces pale and tense. His words were hurried and soft, but none of the family seemed to hear them. They were frozen in place, staring at the figure they loved more than life itself. The king, a tall, imposing figure with eyes that reflected both sorrow and anger, ran his hand through his silvered hair, muttering under his breath about failures of fate and the cruelty of the stars. His voice was steady but strained, and his shoulders bore a weight that seemed almost impossible for any being to carry. Beside him, the queen clutched the edge of the bed, her hands trembling, her nails digging faint grooves into the glowing crystal. She refused to speak or even blink, lest she shatter the fragile thread that kept her daughter alive. Around them, the younger siblings shuffled nervously, whispering to each other about omens and signs and trying not to cry. The walls of the chamber were lined with intricate carvings, depicting the history of their people, the rise and fall of empires and battles won through courage and wisdom. Now they seemed like silent witnesses to a moment that threatened to undo all of history. The palace guards stationed at the entrance shifted from foot to foot, their armor softly clinking, and their eyes darting to the doors as if expecting some invisible threat to appear at any moment. Outside the heavy gates, the garden spread in wild, unkempt beauty. Trees with luminescent leaves swayed gently despite the still air, and fountains trickled softly, sending ripples through pools that reflected the strange colored sky above. The wind carried with it the scent of distant storms and salt from the ocean far beyond the cliffs, and it mingled with the scent of the alien blossoms inside, creating a dizzying perfume that made the heart race in both fear and awe. Every so often, a small flicker of movement passed beneath the princess's closed eyelids, and those around the bed leaned forward, straining to catch some sign that she might still hear them. The air was electric with tension, and the soft hum of the palace, combined with the distant thunder of the world outside, made it feel as if time itself had slowed to a crawl and waited with bated breath for a miracle. Rumors spread like wildfire throughout the palace that no medicine or magic could save the princess, leaving her family desperate and restless. The hallways were alive with whispered speculation and hurried footsteps as nobles and servants alike tried to grasp the enormity of the situation. Some claimed they had seen omens in the sky, others muttered about curses or ancient debts long forgotten, but all were united by the sense of helplessness that clung to the castle like a thick fog. In the servants' quarters, young attendants huddled together, speaking in hushed tones about how fragile she looked, how her breaths came shallow and uneven, and how the light in her eyes had dimmed with each passing hour. The words spread quickly, reaching the ears of scholars and alchemists who had dedicated their lives to the study of life and death, and they shook their heads in disbelief, knowing that their most potent remedies were powerless against whatever had seized her. The king paced endlessly through the private chambers, his long robes whispering against the marble floors, his fingers drumming on his chest in a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. He muttered names of healers and distant planets he could summon for aid, but each idea was more impossible than the last, and each failure weighed heavier on his shoulders. Beside him, the queen remained frozen in a silent vigil, her eyes dry from unshed tears, her mind replaying every moment of the princess's childhood. From the first steps to the laughter that once echoed through the palace halls, she clenched her hands until her knuckles turned white, imagining a future without her daughter, and it sent a shiver of fear through her entire body. Outside the palace gardens, shimmered under a sky that alternated between hues of violet and deep crimson, as if reflecting the turmoil. Within, the fountains trickled uncertainly, and petals from luminescent flowers floated on the wind like tiny ghosts. The gardeners whispered that nature itself seemed to mourn, and even the wind carried a sense of sorrow that made every pause to breathe. The younger siblings of the princess darted nervously from room to room, stealing glances at the empty corridors and the shadowed windows. Some whispered that the stars themselves had turned their gaze away, leaving the princess in isolation and despair. Even the palace guards, who had once stood firm with unflinching discipline, now moved with hesitant steps, their eyes constantly flicking toward the chamber, as if expecting some invisible doom to emerge and snatch the princess away from them forever. In the observation decks, high above the palace, the scholars debated urgently what could be done, their voices low and tense, their fingers tracing patterns in the air, as if drawing life back into existence with mere motion. Each suggestion seemed both brilliant and impossible, as the clock ticked with a cruel rhythm that none could escape. Meanwhile, the city outside began to sense the tension. The usual hum of life slowed, and even the traders and travelers paused in the streets, whispering about the pale princess of Xyrian and the impending shadow that hung over the palace. Every creature, from soaring sky birds to the luminescent insects that danced along the walls, seemed to hesitate in their movements, as if acknowledging the gravity of the moment, and no one dared to speak too loudly or move too quickly lest they disturb the fragile thread that still held her to life. The entire kingdom seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for some impossible miracle to reach across the chasm of despair and light the spark of hope that had almost vanished from their hearts. From the human world, a young scholar arrived, carrying strange instruments and an unusual calm that puzzled the court. His ship had glided silently through the violet sky, leaving only a faint trail of silver light as it descended toward the palace courtyard. The guards at the gates froze for a moment, unsure whether to challenge this outsider or allow him passage, and the whispers spread quickly through the halls of the approaching human, who had never been seen before in the history of Xyrian. The scholar stepped onto the crystalline floors barefoot, feeling the pulse of the palace beneath him, his eyes scanning the intricate carvings along the walls, the depictions of battles long past, the soaring towers and glimmering fountains, all of it bathed in a light that seemed almost alive. He carried nothing more than a satchel filled with instruments that hummed faintly, and a small vial of liquid that glowed softly with an inner warmth. The air seemed to thicken around him as he moved deliberately through the corridors, servants and nobles alike stepping aside instinctively, as if some unseen force demanded it. The king and queen watched from the chamber doors, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and desperation, their hearts pounding at the sight of the human who dared approach their dying daughter without fear or hesitation. The younger siblings whispered among themselves, trying to understand the strange presence of this being who radiated calm, while the palace itself seemed to tense at his approach. Every step he took was measured and precise, his gaze never leaving the doors that led to the princess's chamber. Even as guards whispered warnings and advisors muttered urgently about protocol and the risks of allowing a stranger to touch royalty, the walls seemed to hum softly beneath his feet, as if recognizing the rhythm of his presence, and the faint glow from his instruments cast shifting patterns on the marble floors that made it seem as if the palace itself was alive, waiting for him to act. He paused briefly at the threshold of the chamber, feeling the pull of the life within the fragile princess, as though some invisible thread tugged at him, drawing him closer, and he inhaled slowly, letting the scent of alien blossoms and the faint hum of the palace fill him with a strange clarity. The royal family held their breath, the king gripping the edge of the doorway, the queen biting her lip in silent hope and fear, the siblings pressing close against each other, their wide eyes fixed on the figure who might hold the key to their beloved princess's survival. The human finally knelt beside the crystalline bed, and his hands hovered momentarily over the pale skin of the princess's, touch careful and reverent, and a faint glow began to emanate from the instruments he had brought, as if responding to the pulse of her fading life. He whispered words in a language no one recognized, and the air seemed to shimmer with a soft vibration that made the hairs on the guards' necks stand on end. The room felt smaller and larger, at the same time the walls and ceiling bending in the periphery of vision, and the glow of the princess's body responded slowly to the warmth of his presence. Like a delicate flower sensing the approach of spring, the court watched silently, stunned by the calm authority he exuded, by the soft pulse of energy that filled the chamber and By the way, the faintest hint of color began to return to the princess's skin, as if hope itself had found a conduit in this mysterious human. He entered the chamber, ignoring the gasps and stares of the royal guards. As he knelt beside the fragile princess, the air seemed heavier now, as if every heartbeat in the room had slowed to match the rhythm of the fading life before him. The walls shimmered faintly, reflecting the soft glow of her skin, and the pale light from the hovering lamps cast strange patterns that danced across the marble floors. Her family clustered around the bed, frozen in awe and fear. The king gripped the edge of the crystalline bed, his knuckles white, his jaw tight as he watched the human bend closer. The queen pressed her palms together, her fingers trembling and whispering silent prayers that mingled with the soft hum of the palace. The younger siblings clutched at one another, unable to look away from the scene unfolding before them. Every nurse and attendant in the room held their breath, hoping and fearing that even the slightest movement might shatter the fragile thread that still kept her alive. The human scholar placed his hands gently on her glowing skin and closed his eyes, as if sensing the rhythm of her life. He whispered words that none of the court could understand, but the air seemed to respond, vibrating softly, and the faint glow around her veins brightened imperceptibly. Her chest rose and fell with a trembling effort, and a shiver passed through her body that made even the hardened palace guards flinch. The human remained calm, his hands steady and warm, as though drawing unseen energy from somewhere beyond the walls of the palace. He tilted his head slightly, feeling a pulse beneath his palms, and the princess shivered again, this time more noticeably, and her fingers twitched slightly against the soft sheets covering her. Her family gasped, her mother clutched her face, and let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a cry of relief. The king took a tentative step forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. Unable to comprehend what he was witnessing, the younger siblings leaned over the edge of the bed, peering closely at the human who seemed to channel something miraculous into their sister. The air in the chamber began to shift, a gentle hum building. As the glow from the human spread into the princess's body, her eyelids fluttered and the softest hint of color returned to her cheeks. The nurses whispered prayers under their breath, and even the palace guards lowered their weapons, as if acknowledging that this was no ordinary healing. The chamber itself seemed to lean in closer, as if the walls and ceilings were witnesses straining to see life return to one so precious. Every shadow and reflection danced in harmony with the soft pulses emanating from the human and the subtle shimmer of the princess's skin. Her breathing became steadier, her fingers flexing slowly, and her body warming beneath his hands. The queen fell to her knees, whispering thanks. The king dropped beside her, still staring in disbelief, and the siblings pressed their faces to the edge of the bed, unable to speak. The human remained focused, calm, and patient, his eyes closed as he continued to guide the faint currents of energy through her fragile form, and the palace seemed to hum a collective sigh as life stirred once more within the young princess. Her family gathered closer, unable to believe their eyes. The queen pressed her forehead to the princess's hand, tears streaming silently down her face. The king wrapped an arm around his wife, holding her as if anchoring himself to reality. The younger siblings whispered in awe and fear, while the palace seemed to hold its breath, anticipating the impossible miracle that continued to unfold. Before them, the soft glow from the human's hands spread warmth through the chamber, filling every corner. With a gentle light that shimmered off the walls and floors, servants and guards alike felt the energy pulse through them, hearts beating faster with hope. Every flicker of movement from the princess was met with gasps and stifled cries as the family clung to each sign of life. Her fingers twitched and then flexed fully, her eyelids lifted slowly, revealing eyes that sparkled with faint color for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The queen leaned closer, whispering words of love and relief. The king's voice caught in his throat, unable to speak. As the miracle solidified before him, the human remained kneeling beside the princess, his hands glowing faintly, his focus unbroken, his calm presence anchoring the chaotic emotions of the room. Even the youngest sibling smiled softly, feeling the warmth of life return to their beloved sister. The palace itself seemed to vibrate with energy, the walls reflecting the golden glow. The fountains in the distant courtyard caught the light and scattered it like stars across the marble floors. Every being present felt the impossible connection between human and alien. The sense of wonder and awe mingled with relief and hope. The hum of the palace rose and fell in rhythm with the pulses of light. The princess drew a deep breath, her chest rising fully, her body relaxing for the first time. The queen let out a long shaky sigh, and the king's hand gripped her shoulder. The siblings cheered softly, the guards lowered their heads in respect, and even the servants allowed themselves to smile. The human's hands moved slowly across her form, guiding the energy gently and carefully, ensuring that life fully returned. The princess shivered slightly once more, then settled fully into the bed, her eyes wide and aware. The family's amazement turned to joy, their disbelief giving way to gratitude and awe. The palace seemed to sigh collectively, and the impossible had begun to feel real in that luminous chamber filled with hope and light. A faint hum began to rise from his hands as he touched her cold skin, and a warmth like sunlight started to bloom throughout the chamber. The glow expanded slowly from his palms into her veins, tracing delicate patterns that pulsed rhythmically with each beat of her heart. Her family watched as if witnessing the impossible unfold in real time. The queen pressed a trembling hand to her lips, unable to speak. The king's eyes widened in disbelief, and the younger siblings clung to each other, unable to tear their gaze away. Every breath the princess drew seemed fuller and richer as the warmth spread through her body. Her fingers twitched and flexed as if testing the strength returning to them. The palace walls seemed to absorb the glow emanating from the human and reflect it in shimmering waves across the floors and ceiling, creating an ethereal tapestry of light that bathed everyone present in its golden hue. The attending nurses whispered amongst themselves about miracles and ancient prophecies that spoke of healing powers beyond any known magic or science. Some of the guards lowered their heads in reverence as they felt the energy brush against their own skin, sending tingles up their arms and legs. The younger siblings giggled softly with awe as tiny sparks of light flickered over the princess's hair and shoulders like fireflies dancing in the twilight. Her eyelids fluttered and she opened her eyes fully, revealing irises that shone with a strange brilliance that made everyone gasp and step back slightly. The king took a tentative step forward, his voice caught as he tried to speak words of gratitude, but none came. The queen fell to her knees, clasping her hands together, whispering silent thanks. The human remained kneeling beside the princess, his face calm, his eyes closed as he guided the flow of energy carefully through her fragile form. His fingers traced faint arcs across her skin, and the faint glow became more intense, brighter than the palace lights, yet soft and gentle like morning sunlight touching the earth for the first time. The hum grew louder, in harmony with the pulse of her revived heart, sending vibrations that resonated through the floors and walls, like a symphony of life. Returning, the princess shivered slightly as the warmth enveloped her body, then stretched her arms slowly, feeling strength and vitality return to every limb. The attending staff moved closer, cautiously witnessing what they could only describe as a living miracle. Some whispered that the energy seemed intelligent, responding to the needs of the body, as if it were a living entity in itself. Her family gasped collectively at the sight, their disbelief giving way to tears of joy and relief. The queen pressed her cheek to her daughter's hand, the king rested a hand on her shoulder, and the siblings leaned in to touch her glowing skin, feeling warmth and life in a way they never had before. Even the palace seemed to exhale the tension of weeks and months, as if it had been holding its breath for this very moment. The human guided the final currents of energy through her, slowly withdrawing his hands as the glow faded into a gentle shimmer, leaving her fully healed, radiant and alive. The princess shivered violently, and a ripple of light danced across her body, and the court watched with stunned disbelief. Her eyes blinked slowly, taking in the faces of her family and the human kneeling beside her, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she moved her fingers, curling them slowly into fists, testing the strength that had returned to them. The queen gasped, pressing her palms against her mouth, unable to contain the wave of relief and joy that surged through her heart. The king took a cautious step forward, his eyes wide with astonishment, and his chest heaving as he tried to steady himself. The younger siblings pressed closer to the bed, their faces filled with wonder and disbelief, as their sister flexed her arms and then stretched them slowly, feeling the warmth of life coursing through every limb. The attending nurses and guards, who had been tense and silent, erupted into soft exclamations of amazement, whispering words of gratitude and awe. The glow that had spread through her body slowly dimmed, leaving a soft shimmer that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat, like a quiet echo of the miraculous energy that had revived her. The human scholar remained kneeling beside her bed, his hands hovering momentarily before gently withdrawing, as if releasing a river of light back into the world. His calm expression belied the intensity of what had just occurred, yet there was a softness in his eyes, a quiet satisfaction that life had been restored. The princess sat up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, testing the strength in her legs and arms. Her family leaned in instinctively, helping her balance. The queen, wrapping an arm around her waist, and the king steadying her shoulders. The younger siblings reached out to touch her hands and arms, feeling warmth and vitality in every point of contact. Their voices trembled with excitement and relief as they whispered her name over and over. The palace itself seemed to respond to the miracle, the walls reflecting a gentle light that shimmered like water in the sun, the soft hum of life returning, vibrating through every stone and crystal, and even the flowers in the chamber seemed to lift slightly, as if rejoicing with the family. The princess looked around the room, her gaze settling on each of her loved ones in turn, and a faint smile curved her lips. The first real expression of happiness she had shown in weeks. The queen pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. The king exhaled a deep, shaky sigh, and the siblings laughed softly, tears running down their faces. The human watched quietly, giving them space, his presence steady and reassuring, a silent acknowledgement that the impossible had been accomplished. Every breath in the room felt lighter, the tension dissipating as the miracle fully revealed itself. Her body moved fluidly for the first time, testing the limits of her strength, and the family marveled at how completely the human had restored life to her fragile form. Even the palace guards lowered their heads in respect and wonder as the princess stretched and moved her arms and legs, fully feeling the vigor of life returning with each movement. Slowly her chest rose and fell steadily, and her eyes flickered open, first with confusion, then with wonder, as life returned. Her family fell to their knees, the queen pressing her forehead against the princess's hand, the king gripping her shoulders, as if anchoring himself to the miracle, and the younger siblings leaning in to touch her cheeks and hair, unable to stop the soft gasps of awe and joy that escaped them. The palace seemed to vibrate with the energy of the moment, the walls reflecting faint glimmers of light from the princess's skin, and the instruments the human had used shimmered softly in response to the pulse of life coursing through her. Every breath she took felt fuller and deeper, as though she were drawing not just air, but the very essence of existence into herself. She flexed her fingers, curling them into fists, then releasing them, testing the newfound strength and vitality, and her family cheered softly, unable to contain their relief and amazement. The attending nurses whispered amongst themselves about ancient prophecies that spoke of healers and miracles that could cross worlds and dimensions, while the palace guards lowered their weapons and bowed their heads in reverence. Even the youngest sibling laughed with tears streaming down their face as they pressed close to their sister. The human scholar remained, kneeling beside the bed, his eyes closed, his hands hovering briefly over her shoulders, then withdrawing as he sensed the final currents of life had been fully restored. He spoke nothing, yet his presence radiated calm, an assurance that the miracle was complete. The queen embraced her daughter, pressing her cheek against hers and whispering words of love and gratitude. The king rested, a firm hand on her back, feeling the warmth and strength of life return through every fiber of her being. The princess blinked slowly, taking in the faces around her, her eyes wide with amazement and cautious joy. She reached out hesitantly, touching the glowing crystal of her bed, and then the hands of her family, feeling the connection and the unbroken thread of life that had been restored to her. The younger siblings giggled softly, dancing around the bed, unable to believe that the sister they had feared to lose was fully alive again. Even the palace itself seemed to respond to the miracle, the soft hum of the walls and floors vibrating in harmony with the pulse of her revived heart, and the light reflecting from the crystal surfaces shimmered like liquid gold in every corner of the chamber. The servants and attendants watched silently, their faces pale with awe and tears brimming in their eyes. The air was thick with a mixture of relief and disbelief, as if the kingdom itself could not comprehend the impossible event that had just unfolded. The human finally rose slowly from his kneeling position and gave a quiet nod toward the princess's family, acknowledging the completion of the miracle and the bonds that had been strengthened by his touch. The princess moved her arms, gracefully testing their strength, smiling faintly at her family as they erupted into cries of joy and relief, and the palace seemed to exhale as one collective being filled with the hope and life that had been returned to the young alien princess. The human stepped back and watched silently as the princess smiled, and the palace was filled with hope once more. Her family could hardly contain themselves. The queen pressed her hands against her heart, tears streaming freely down her face. The king exhaled deeply, his chest heaving, and the younger siblings danced lightly around the bed, unable to stop their laughter and cries of joy. The princess stretched her arms, fully testing the strength that had returned to her body, and gasped softly at the sensation of vitality flowing through every limb. She moved her fingers slowly, then quickly feeling the pulse of life in each joint and muscle. Her eyes sparkled with wonder as she looked around, the chamber taking in the faces of her family and the human who had restored her. The attending nurses and attendants whispered softly to each other, marveling at the miracle they had witnessed, their voices filled with awe and disbelief. The palace guards stood quietly in reverence, and some lowered their heads, while others watched with wide eyes, unable to comprehend the energy that had passed through the chamber. The walls seemed to shimmer faintly, reflecting the glow from the princess's skin and the soft light that lingered from the instruments the human had carried. The younger siblings reached up, touching her cheeks, her hands and arms, laughing softly as they felt the warmth of life and vitality return to her. They pressed their foreheads against hers and whispered words of love and relief. The queen knelt beside her daughter, holding her hands tightly, unable to stop the tears of joy that flowed freely. The king placed both hands on her shoulders, feeling the strength and life radiate beneath his touch. He whispered words of gratitude that were barely audible. Through his emotion, the human scholar finally stood fully and looked around the room, his face calm but his eyes reflecting the satisfaction of what had been achieved. He nodded silently to the family, acknowledging the bond that had been strengthened and the life that had been restored. The princess rose slowly from the bed, her movements careful and deliberate, testing her balance and agility. Her family assisted her, supporting her waist and arms, and she felt a profound sense of connection and love that had deepened through the fear and the miracle. The palace itself seemed to respond, the walls reflecting light that shimmered like liquid gold, and the soft hum of the floors vibrated gently with the pulse of the revived heart. Even the flowers in the chamber lifted slightly, as if celebrating the return of life. The attending staff whispered prayers of gratitude, the servants allowed themselves to smile openly, and the guards straightened, feeling honored to witness what could only be described as divine intervention. The princess embraced each family member in turn, her smile radiant and full of life. Her eyes returned to the human who had knelt beside her, and she bowed her head softly in gratitude. He offered a quiet nod and stepped back, allowing the family their moment of joy. The palace echoed with laughter, cries and whispers of hope, and the impossible had become reality. Life had been restored, and the bonds of family and trust had been strengthened forever in that luminous chamber, filled with wonder, light, and the quiet hum of a miracle that none would ever forget.